Random House Audiobooks presents The Afterlife and Other Stories by John Updike. Read for you by the author.
The Man Who Became a Soprano. All things have a beginning and an end. The recorder group began in the hothouse warmth of the Weiss's marriage, a model marriage of dark and light, firmness and delicacy, shining on top of their little hill as if for all the town to see. Andrea was a slightly skinny blonde with ironed-looking long straight hair both before and after such hair was the fashion, and pale blue eyes that developed pink lids when she was tired or emotionally stimulated. Fritz was a dark, almost heavy man with wide, hairy-backed hands that, like his tenacious scientist's mind, took up everything in a grip of steel. From a musical family of physicists, he had played the bass recorder since childhood, having been trained in this instrument to round out a quartet consisting of his father, tenor, mother, soprano, and sister, alto. But the bass was a doleful, mumbly instrument played alone, and for their 7th anniversary he bought Andrea a lovely soprano recorder of dark-striped pale pearwood, a Merc. Slowly, obediently, she learned to play it, her hesitant piping echoing through the boxy bare rooms of their white-clapboarded house. Rooms rather under-furnished, their friends thought, with an austere mix of glass tables and Danish modern, Fritz's taste, and imitation shaker chairs and hand-woven wool rugs, Andrea's. She owned a loom as big as a small room, and spent afternoons at it, before the 3 children, girl, boy, girl, came home from school. There was a shy and stubborn expertise to all she did, though on the soprano recorder she tended to panic at any note higher than the G at the top of the staff, and when a trill involved moving more than one finger on the stops, she fluttered off into blushing silence. When she blushed, her cheeks suddenly matched the tint of her lids and lips, and the rose color sank into her throat and the loose neck of her peasant blouse. There is little music arranged for the bass and the soprano in duet, though some of the Bach fugues build to a certain passion without the middle voices. The Weiss's 3 children, some nights, would be kept awake as the couple moved the theme back and forth, from low to high to low, and at intervals beat time in silence, or held harmonic whole notes, while the absent instruments possessed the melody. The sounds carried beyond the house. Another couple, the Bridgetons, had moved to town, and lived along the beach road at the base of the Weiss's hill, close enough to hear them these spring nights, now that the storm windows were off. In the crowded high school corridor, as they waited to be checked into the Maytown meeting, Terry Bridgeton mentioned the music to Fritz. They knew each other by sight from the train platform and Little League games, and said how lovely it sounded from afar. Terry allowed that he was a musical ignoramus, but his wife, Jessie, was a kind of marvel. She could play anything, piano, guitar, church organ, even the clarinet when she was a girl. Fritz told him, "The recorder is the easiest instrument in the world to learn, next to the triangle and the tambourine, and I suppose the maracas." There was a German pedantry to Fritz. "Well," Terry said, blushing with his own effrontery, or from the heat of the high school hall, "we could both try to learn, if you'd tell us what instruments to get." "Alto and tenor," Fritz said firmly, then, suspecting he had allowed himself to get in too deep, added, "Of course, you and your wife may not take to the instruments." Jessie, an olive-skinned, short, plumpish, eagerly smiling woman in bangs, somewhat alarmingly clad in a fringed shawl and a tangle of gold and turquoise pendants, spoke up behind them. "Oh, we'll take to them. We're desperate to do something and meet some people." It was high summer before the Bridgetons, having put themselves to school with Mario Duchesne's Method for the Recorder and Marguerite Dubé's First Recorder book, dared present themselves to the Weisses one agreed-upon evening. Andrea had suggested they come for dessert and coffee, and then give it a try. The newborn quartet was able to make its way, with many halts and restarts, through a Bach fugue without flats and sharps, several Corelli gigs, and the first sheet of a bird fantasia before the clock struck 10, and it was time for cigarettes and beer and a social exchange. After their immersion in music, a warmth remained, and the two couples had more in common than their costumes. Terry was an artist in an ad agency, and dressed after work in frayed jeans and logoed T-shirts. But, though they promised to meet again and again, it was uncomfortable, somehow too naked. Each player, alone on his or her part, was embarrassed whenever he or she became lost and the whole quartet had to stagger to a halt. Musical Jessie, confidently warbling on her alto, rarely slipped and tried to keep the tempo up, and Fritz, in his steely way, persevered on the bass, which made so low and indistinct a noise that it scarcely mattered if he was in time with the others or not. But Terry, as he said, was a musical novice, and sometimes intently went along measure after measure on his tenor without realizing that he was a beat behind and generating dissonance on every chord. Andrea, though more practiced than he, was almost too sensitive to play the soprano, which by virtue of its pitch had to carry the melody, and yet whose high notes she heard as painfully shrill, a wet, strained squeaking she preferred to put out of its misery, enfolding her recorder with her long, pale, pink-knuckled hands in her lap. Terry loved her in those moments, grateful that someone else was causing the quartet to founder. They had become the clumsy children, and their spouses their formidable parents. The group needed more players, and, magically, more did appear, like dewdrops on a spiderweb. Carolyn Homer, a tall, auburn-haired woman who held aerobics classes in the parish hall of the Congregational Church, turned out to have taught herself the recorder while enrolled, years ago, in a course at the New England Conservatory in Renaissance music. She brought a well-exercised alto instrument, the color worn from its mouthpiece and finger holes, to the group. Dick McHoagland, the squat and scowling leader of the local high school band, and the typing instructor as well, brought a tenor instrument. He and Fritz, both being martinets, hit it off well and played side by side, leaving Terry next to the alto section. Both Dick and Carolyn were married to unmusical spouses, but the town was rich in divorcees and men on the loose, and now these began to adhere. Alice Arsenault, a nervous little rounded thing who for some reason had been married to Skip Arsenault, an uproarious town fireman, former athlete and hard drinker, showed up one night in Carolyn's shadow with a soprano recorder and an earnestly annotated copy of the Trapp Family Singer's Instruction Manual. Maury Sutherland, a stooping, sexually undecided country gentleman, whom Terry had always supposed, from the way he tilted his head and spoke in cautious, fragmented sentences, to be hard of hearing, produced from his inherited treasures an alto recorder acquired by his great-aunt Esther on the Jekyll side, while sightseeing in Austria and northern Italy before the First World War. "Do tell," he would say in response to a lengthy disquisition, with an expression of amiable bafflement, "beats me." This made 3 altos, and soon there were 3 sopranos, since somehow, in Maury's orbit, there materialized...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?